welcome to Good Grief, the podcast dedicated to demystifying and destigmatizing grief, compassion, and sometimes humor. I'm Nikki. I'm an end-of-life doula and a grief coach in Columbus, Ohio. And today, we're going to talk about anticipatory grief. Now, before I dive in and explain what that is and all the ins and outs of pre-grief, as I call it, or pre-grieving, a note: I have a new kitty, and he is currently sitting on my desk right next to my microphone. So we're going to see how this goes. So we have a new little guy in our house. His name is Ari, and it's a long, funny story, but he showed up at my friend's parents' farm, and they're not really pet people, and he just immediately was like, you're my people now, and I love you. He's just an absolute sweetheart, and they knew that eventually we'd be wanting a new cat. So yeah, we came to meet him, and he was just immediately in our laps and in our hearts. So Ari is sitting next to me. He's going to be my little coach here while I record my podcast. It's been an interesting, we've only had him here for a day now, so it's been an interesting day. But I guess I can just briefly go into this because this has to do with grief, because I'm still very much grieving the loss of my other cat. And it's been, to me, it feels like she was just here yesterday, but we're coming up on 1 year since she's been gone. And I still, obviously, I'm never going to stop grieving her because she was my best friend. And I love her so much. And I still think about her every single day, and I still miss her every single day. And this little guy was obviously and definitely not a replacement for Yuna. And no one ever will be. There's never going to be another Yuna, which may or may not be a good thing. But he's not a replacement, and he's not here to help me get over my grief. It just worked out that he found his way into our life. Everything just kind of fell together. It was fate, I guess. But it's wonderful. It's nice to have a cat around again. My husband's went back to work today for the first time since our trip, and I get a little lonely. It's been lonely the last year. Very quiet around the house. So it's nice to have a friend again. Although he's still very new, and he will not leave either one of our sides. So it's hard to get things done. And yeah, I think he's going to be good for me. He's a good little dude. Anyway, enough about cats. So today we're talking about anticipatory grief, which is, I usually call it pre-grief or pre-grieving. It's grieving things that you know are coming. So we can list a million examples of anticipatory grief, but the top ones that usually come to mind are when a loved one or yourself is diagnosed with a terminal illness, be it cancer, ALS, any dementia, Alzheimer's, any terminal disease or terminal illness that there will be no recovery from. Because when that diagnosis comes, it's right there that someone is going to die. And we all understand that when someone dies, there will be grief. And immediately knowing that the end is now coming, and we kind of know when, or we know that it will be here sooner rather than later, that we'll start to grieve that person or, our own life if it's ourselves now, because we all know we're going to die. That's not a secret. Everybody's going to die one day. But when you know now that it's coming, that's when you start to grieve. And that's grieving something that hasn't necessarily happened yet. But it can also be a current grief. You're grieving the loss of your freedom, your health, especially if your health is rapidly declining. But more so, it's grieving something that will come, something that is coming. And also, just to throw it out there, it doesn't necessarily have to be death. There were so many other types of grief that we know about. Let's say you have a loved one in your life that will be going to prison for a long period of time. And, they might not be in jail right this minute, but they will have to surrender themselves and be in prison. And that's coming. It's coming at a certain day. And you're already grieving that this person's going to be out of your life for a while. And they might be grieving, obviously, the loss of their freedom that's upcoming. So grief isn't always about death. I've said that a million times. We know this. But those are just some other examples of anticipatory grief. But another big one that comes to mind is aging parents. I did have somebody asked me to do a podcast on dealing with an aging parent, and I'll do a separate episode on that. But this is part of that. So I think it was Kat who suggested this subject to me. So Kat, if you're listening, you can use this episode as well, because a lot of this has to do with aging parents. Like, this is something I think about. I don't think about it all the time, but obviously, my parents are in their 70s and they will die one day. I've told them multiple times they're not allowed to, but they will. They will be gone. And I absolutely have anticipatory grief for this. So one thing I read, sorry, I'm kind of on a tangent here, but one thing I read in one of the articles, and I'll link the different articles I've read just so you can read through them, is that anticipatory grief can be amplified when it's something that you've dealt with before, like death. You've lost somebody before, and now somebody else is going to die. So that anticipatory grief can be absolutely amplified because you kind of know what to expect, and you know how much it's going to suck. You know how awful it's going to be. And I know my parents are going to die one day, and I lost my only sibling several years ago. So I know what it's going to be like to lose. Obviously every death is different, but going through those griefs again and that loss again, I know it's coming, and it's amplified a little bit because I've experienced a significant and close familial loss at this point. But also knowing that once they're both gone, then I'm not going to say I'm all that's left. My niece and my nephew are still alive, obviously, and I have my husband, and I have my chosen family, as I call them, all my closest friends. And I have extended family, but our little tiny family will be me at some point, and that's hard. I'm even getting a little choky about it right now, like thinking about it, that the family you grow up with has such an impact on you and can be your whole world. I'm not saying that's the case for everybody. Everybody's family is different, and there are a lot of people that had terrible upbringings and awful childhoods. But I had a lovely childhood and a beautiful family, and eventually I'm going to be all that's left, and it's going to be very hard. And I know that now. So when I think about that and when I feel that hurt now, it's anticipatory grief. Another topic I bring up a lot, because let's just face it, it's been huge, is COVID. COVID brought up a lot of anticipatory grief for people, especially those who have family members who are immunocompromised, older, or were already sick. And now there's this huge thing out there that could end any one of their lives at any time, or, permanently damage. I personally know a few people who have long COVID and have been having lasting symptoms for well over a year and a half now. So COVID it brought that out so much in so many people. So now that we kind of know what anticipatory grief is, I'm going to throw something out there. I'm going to throw this up against the wall, see if it sticks. So I always say grief is not necessarily a bad thing, right? And grief is something that shapes who you are as a person and is with you for the rest of your life. Anticipatory grief can sometimes be seen as a good thing. And I know that sounds weird. Most people are like, grief is not good, grief sucks. And it does. Grief does suck. And it can be really hard. It can also be beautiful. As I've said multiple times, grief is just a way of expressing love. Because if you didn't love somebody, why would you be grieving them, right? So anticipatory grief can often be viewed as a good thing. An example of that, and I'll discuss it more in a second, but just an example right off the top of my head is, I've known a couple people in my life who've lost their spouses to cancer. And for both of these people that I'm thinking of off the top of my head right now, their spouse had it wasn't necessarily a really short process of dying. It was not long and drawn out, but they knew it was coming and they had time. They didn't know how much time. And for both of them, it ended up being a significant amount of time, within a year or 2 years, that they had with their partner, their spouse. But they also recognized, this person is going to die. And obviously we all knew that. We all knew these people had cancer. And in the case of one of them, when she passed, he ended up remarried within a year or so, I believe, maybe a year and a half. When that happens, especially when somebody loses a spouse and they're remarried within a short period of time, there's a lot of stigma with that. And a lot of people will look at that and be like, how dare you? She's only been gone so long, or he's only been gone so long. First of all, it's none of your damn business, okay? We'll just get that out there. Other people's relationships are none of your business, okay? Got that there. But you also have to understand that when that happens, the person has started grieving well before their spouse died. They started grieving well before their spouse died. So it's not like as soon as our spouse died, they were over it. Again, you never get over your grief. But you've had time to process that grief ahead of time. So that when the loss occurred, of course it's devastating. Of course it's awful. Of course it's hard. But you've already been going through it for so long. And especially if it's the case of a spouse or somebody very close to you that you're with every single day. You're watching them die over a period of time, whereas other people aren't witnessing all the details and all the pain and the suffering and all the stuff leading up to that person's death. The person who's with them the most is seeing that. So they have all that time to grieve. And when they're gone, they're going to grieve differently because now the loss is real and it's there. But they've already started that grieving process well before a lot of other people have. So, and again, you don't get over your grief, but you're at a point where you can move past it or you can move with it. And I hear stories all the time about people losing their spouse and being remarried and their family being horrified that they remarried so quickly. But again, you have to recognize how long that person's already been grieving. And again, there's never a timeline. There's no timeline for grief. If you lose a spouse and you never remarry, that's okay. That's your life and that's your grief. If you lose a spouse and you remarried in a month, that's your life, that's your choice, and that's your grief, and that's okay. So I'll always say it, you never get over your grief, but more importantly, just remember, guys, other people's relationships are none of your business. So, let's just leave it at that. So that's just an interesting little side story and something I've seen it personally a few times, but have heard stories of, from other people too. So anyway, circling back to how grief can sometimes be a good thing, or anticipatory grief. That's a good example. Maybe it's not a good example, but that is an example of you're having this time to work through your grief. I don't want to say before it really happened, but before the loss has occurred. In a way, the loss has already occurred, but you have time to work through that, especially if it's the case of a spouse. You have time with your spouse, and you guys can work through your grief together. And what a beautiful thing to have each other to lean on in such a crucial time of grieving. But it can also be a time, and not just an example of a spouse, but anytime you're experiencing anticipatory grief, it's giving you an opportunity for growth. To start processing the grief. So I don't want to say so you're prepared. You're never prepared and you never know how you're going to act when a loss occurs or how it's going to feel. But it gives you time to start feeling that grief and recognizing its presence so that you can work with it. It's also a great time to work on closure, reconcile differences, forgive people, accept forgiveness from other people. It's a chance to say goodbye. So knowing knowing a loss is coming and having time to start grieving it now can be such a beautiful gift for all of those reasons. So all that said, having anticipatory grief ahead of time, it's not necessarily going to make your grief when the loss occurs, it's not going to make that grief easier. It's not going to make it shorter, and it's not going to make it go away. Because again, everybody's grief is different and every loss is different. It's not necessarily going to help, but it can. So when you start feeling grief for somebody and you're a caregiver, now again, this can be a spouse, this can be a child, this can be a sibling. If you're the caregiver of someone who is dying, that can make your anticipatory grief very complicated. And we'll go into complicated grief another day. But there's a lot of levels to grieving when you're a caregiver as well. And these are things I've just found through my work as a doula and through my studying with end-of-life work and I've spoken to a lot of people who are caregivers for parents, spouses, sometimes children, adult children, or teenage children who are dying. And when you are a caregiver, like I said, it can make things very complicated because A, you're starting to grieve this loss that will occur, but B, you're kind of currently grieving your own loss of your freedom, yourself, especially if it's going to be a difficult end or a difficult process, and you know that you're going to have to give up a lot of your own life and personal freedoms to take care of this person. And you're grieving the loss of those personal freedoms and your life as you know it, so to speak. Not necessarily saying that it's a bad thing. You know, I'm assuming if someone's taking over as a caregiver, it's because they want to and because they love that person. So, how do we cope with anticipatory grief? Well, a lot of the same things you hear me say all the time. But on top of that too, it's important to understand what you're feeling and that it is anticipatory grief, but also recognizing that you might experience a lot of pushback from other people, which there's always going to be that person that insists they know how you should be grieving because they're the expert somehow. And again, your grief is your own, but there might be people that they're in a different place in their grief, and you've already started grieving somebody that you know will die, and they don't understand why you're grieving now, or they take it as an offense because they're not ready to face that. They're not ready to face that this loss will be coming. They're not ready to face that person's that imminent loss. And because they're not ready, they don't want you to be ready either. So recognizing that you might see that, you might experience that, and to give a little compassion, to that person who might be in a different place in their grief. Not necessarily snapping back. This isn't a place to start arguments like, how dare you tell me how to grieve, or I'll grieve when I want to. They're obviously struggling with it, and they're in a different place than you are. So just extending a little bit of compassion, as you would hope others would extend that compassion to you. So recognizing those, and also recognizing, what you're feeling is in fact anticipatory grief. Share your feelings, talk about them. Again, I'm going to tell you the same things about coping with grief a lot. Talk about your feelings. Talk about them with people you trust. Talk about them with a counselor, therapist, or a clergy member, whoever you're comfortable talking with. You talk about them, journal about them. And I've talked about how to honor people that you have lost. And again, this is a gift. The loss is coming, so you can work with the person who's going to be gone. Work with the person who's dying or who's leaving or whatever the process is, and say, what can we do together so that I can help honor you and your memory and your life? It can be such a beautiful gift, even though obviously it is devastating. Now, you might hear people say, oh, great, you have time to prepare for this. You can't really prepare. There's no way to prepare for things like this. And you never know how you're going to react when somebody dies or when a loss occurs. Even when you know it's coming, you don't know how you're going to react. You really don't know how you're going to react. It could be, you might feel relief. You might feel humor in the situation. You might feel way worse than you ever imagined you were going to feel. You might imagine this is going to be the hardest thing I've ever gone through, and it's worse. So you can't really prepare yourself for what's about to come, but you do at least have an opportunity to start your grieving process. Start working through it. Use your grief. Use your grief as an excuse to spend time with somebody. If you know your parents are getting older, whatever, use that. Visit your parents more often. Visit your family member more often. Spend more time with the person that you're, afraid will be gone one day. And I mentioned before things about like using that time for forgiveness, things like that. Use this as an opportunity to bury hatchets and strengthen your relationship with that person. Okay, so that's really all I have on anticipatory grief, and forgive any background noises. We're still working on training little Ari here, and he's been up on my desk this whole time, jumping up and down, so I've had to pause and edit a bit. But anyway, so yeah, all right. Well, with that being the end of the episode, it's time for the death deck. So I'm going to shuffle through here and pick a card at random for our thought-provoking question of the week. Oh, wow. Okay, this is good. These are all good. What am I saying? So this one is called The End. What celebrity suicide had the most profound effect on you? Ooh, that's a hard one. That is tough. So obviously suicide in general is very tough. And that's very specific too. It's not just a celebrity death, but a celebrity suicide. I guess for me, I would have to say Robin Williams for a myriad of reasons. Having a history in performing and comedy, obviously I just loved him. And I also identified with him to a degree, having mental illness myself and recognizing what it's like to try to be funny all the time when sometimes you're really suffering. And I don't know, his death, it absolutely came as a shock to me. Like, I feel like a lot of people weren't too terribly surprised, but I was, and very hurt, because for a lot of reasons. He was an amazing comedian and human being, and he's gone now. There were periods of time where that one hurt the most, because when I've been in situations where I have felt really alone and in the darkest dark, there's always hope that there were people I have seen, especially people that I see not necessarily in my personal life, but in the celebrity world or in the news or wherever, that are surviving. And that gave me senses of hope, and to see him go was hard, because that kind of took away that little bit of hope. There are plenty of other people that are still thriving to this day and surviving, but just every time there's a loss like that to something so dark, yeah, it kind of hits home a little bit. So that one I would definitely say his had the most profound effect on me. So, oh man, that got dark. Well, that sucks. I don't mean to end an episode on a dark note. Well, I could tell a joke. Do you want to hear a joke? So, not everybody knows this story, but at his deathbed, Achilles realized that they were going to lose the war, and he uttered his last words: "Defeat hurts." Okay, I'm sorry. No, I'm not. I'm not sorry. I'm never sorry for my bad jokes. You live with them. All right. Thank you so much for tuning in this week. I hope you got something out of this episode. Please tell your friends, family, roommates, neighbors, people you see at the bus stop. Share it on social media about my podcast. And check me out. Check me out on Patreon. As always, all the money I receive through Patreon goes directly to a fund for me to provide pro bono services to those who cannot afford my help. And that's it. I hope you have a great week. Thank you so much for tuning in. And remember, your grief is yours. It's always okay. And grief doesn't always have to suck. Good Grief was brought to you by me. You can find me online at nikkithedeathdoula.com. Today's episode was produced by me. Research and scripts written by me. Your host is me. Editing and sound design also me. Music is not me. Music is Cheery Monday by Kevin MacLeod. License information can be found at filmmusic.io/standard-license. Special thank you to my best friend and husband for constantly reassuring me that I don't suck.